Many of you were here before, so I won't go through the whole introduction again, but I'd just like to introduce again Dr. Steve Chu. He's going to talk about using formative assessment to help students. If last talk was any indication, this is really going to be very interesting and helpful and applicable very, very quickly in your class. So, Steve?
Great, thanks. Thanks, Chris. All right, well, thanks once again to Chris for the invitation to come out and talk to y'all. So the second talk I'm going to do is going to talk about formative assessments and how they can be used to improve student learning. So let's talk about what I'm going to do. I'm going to introduce the concept of formative assessment if you haven't heard of it before. If you have, hopefully I'm going to kind of elaborate on some more of the conceptual background of formative assessment and how show you different goals, learning goals that can be used to achieve, then demonstrate multiple methods of formative assessment. So everyone should have a handout there. Actually, I need to look at one. We're going to be doing an activity here. You'll need a pen or a pencil at some point. I'll let you know when we get to that point. Okay. So what's a formative assessment? Okay. Formative assessments were first formalized by Angelo and Cross, a classic study book, Classroom Assessment Techniques. Now we call them formative assessments. Basically, they're brief, low-stakes assessments that give students and teachers feedback before the exams or the high-stake assessments. Okay, so they are brief. They don't take a lot of time. They're low stakes. They're either done for no credit or very little credit. They provide feedback to both teacher and students. They aren't just for students, they're for teachers as well to gauge the level of understanding, and they always occur before summative assessments. So your summative assessment, your exam, should never be the first time you actually assess student levels of understanding. You should always have a sense of this well before you get to that test. Okay, so you can address a number of different goals of formative assessment. Here they are. So you can improve metacognition. I talked about metacognition before. Metacognition is your awareness of your own level of understanding. So that's useful for the students to be able to self-assess their level of understanding, and it's useful for teachers to assess the understanding of the class. They can address tenacious student misconceptions. Students don't come to us as blank slates. They come to us with prior beliefs and misconceptions. Not just about the content, but also about they have beliefs about how hard your class should be, what's a fair amount of work that they should do. And if you violate that belief, then you run the risk of the students really feeling like you're just being really unfair, you're being too hard. And formative assessments can help to calibrate the proper level of effort and understanding that the students need to have. You can illustrate the desired level. I just talked about this. You can promote student learning, application, and transfer. So formative assessments are actually a very powerful way of improving student learning by giving them practice, retrieving and applying information, by spacing practice. So you can actually improve their learning as part of class. And then promotes rapport and trust. A lot of times students think that we're out to sort them out. So especially freshmen or first year students, general psych, I've had students tell me well, you're just trying to recruit the majors and get rid of everybody else. Or, this is a bust out class for computer science. You're trying to get rid of the people who don't belong in computer science. So formative assessments actually can show that you want the students to succeed by previewing to them the kinds of items that they're going to have to answer on exams. So you can build a rapport with students, and they'll learn to trust you that you want them to succeed. And then you can model thinking for understanding. So a lot of times we'll provide answers to items or answers to examples or problems and not model how we arrive at those answers. And formative assessment can allow you to kind of explain your reasoning. This is how I identify this kind of problem and not another kind of a problem. This is how I identify the critical components. This is how I combine them, and I apply this formula or apply this reasoning or apply this principle, and this is how I get this answer. And oftentimes faculty don't do that. They just assume that, it's obvious, and it's not obvious to the students. Okay, so here are the cognitive challenges to teaching. So I've kind of distilled everything I know about cognitive psychology applied to education, and I've distilled them down into these 9 challenges that all teachers must overcome when they're teaching. Student mental mindset. This involves the student attitude and beliefs about the course. What's gotten most attention is Dweck's work on growth versus fixed mindset. Very important work, but it actually goes beyond that. It talks about, their attitudes, like, are they fearing your class? Are they anxious about your class? How do they approach it? Do they believe, like in general psych, one of the problems we have to overcome is they feel like it's common sense and it should be like an easy course, that they shouldn't have to work very hard at it. It's actually, to me, in my experience, it was the hardest psych course I took as an undergrad. So metacognition and self-regulation. So we have to give them a sense of what their level of understanding is. Student fear and mistrust, this idea that teachers are out to sort of weed me out and they're out to sort of sort students into the capable and incapable students. Prior knowledge. The more you know about a subject area, then the easier it is to learn. Misconceptions, student misconceptions about the topic that they bring to the classroom. Ineffective learning strategies, the most popular learning strategies that students use are the least effective for learning. So mindlessly rereading, going over material over and over again, spending hours memorizing flashcards. Those are the least effective study strategies. Transfer of learning. A lot of times students think that the knowledge they learn in a class is only true for that class and that teacher. So, they may actually learn something that's contradictory in a different class and that doesn't really bother them. Okay, I'm learning what I'm supposed to give the teacher back on the exam, and after that, I don't have to think about it ever again. And so, you have to promote that transfer learning, that this knowledge is important for you to remember and use outside of class. Constraints and selective attention, we talked about this in the earlier talk. Attention is one of the main constraints on learning. And then constraints in mental effort and working memory. That I didn't get to this before. I may get to it if I have time during this talk. Mental effort or concentration is another one of those major constraints on our ability to learn. So basically what you're doing when you're teaching is you are managing these 9 different challenges. This is the way I think about teaching. Teaching is not about presenting information. It is getting students to learn by managing this 9-way interaction of factors that's constantly changing. Right? So some of these factors you have direct control over. Others you have no control over whatsoever. You just have to monitor them. Right? So you are just, for a particular classroom of students, you are managing and monitoring and manipulating these 9 factors to result in a desired kind of learning. Right? This is why the pedagogy used at the 8 o'clock section does really well. Use the same pedagogy at the 9 o'clock and it just falls flat, right? Because each class is different and you are monitoring that 9-way interaction. Okay, so formative assessment can address these parts of those challenges. So 7 out of the 9, pretty good, right? So the only ones they can't really help you out with is probably prior knowledge and constraints of selective attention. And I can argue that actually it can at least help you monitor what the prior knowledge might be. But you can actually address all of these challenges, 7 out of the 9 challenges, using formative assessment. But you have to design the formative assessment to address a particular challenge. Okay, so a lot of teachers will use formative assessment, but they won't use it intentionally, and they won't maximize or optimize the feedback from that. So what I want you to do is think about, what am I trying to accomplish with this formative assessment? Pick the formative assessment that is going to match the challenge that you want to address. Okay, so here's a common scenario in teaching that formative assessment can help you out with. So a student studies hard for an exam, feel confident taking it. The results are much worse than the student expected. And so, of course, who do the student blame? They blame you, right? They say, oh, that sneaky instructor, always asking tricky questions, or my favorite is when the student goes, well, you didn't ask me the information that I know. Like, that's my responsibility to do that. Okay, but then the instructor believes that he or she has delivered a brilliant set of lectures, confident the students have mastered the knowledge, the students are tracking them and right with them, but then the student performance of the exam reflects really poor understanding, and the instructor grumbles, those lazy students, they just don't pay attention, right? Have you ever believe the students were with you and then become really discouraged at the exam when obviously they weren't? Okay, so this is poor metacognition for both the student and the teacher. They're both overconfident. The student is overconfident, they know. The teacher is overconfident, the students have learned. And formative assessment can prevent this. Okay, so this is the logic of formative assessment, basically. All right, so, if you hit the sign, you'll hit that bridge, right? So the formative assessment is an early warning signal to both faculty and the students that, the learning is not where it needs to be. Okay, so a lot of teachers already use clickers or Kahoot, or they use Think, Pair, Share, but this gets at a fundamental misunderstanding of what pedagogy is. Pedagogy is not practice and procedure. If you use clickers or use Think, Pair, Share, that does not mean you're using formative assessment as a pedagogical tool. A pedagogical tool is a theory-driven practice to achieve a certain learning goal. So you need to have not just a practice, but there should be a rationale behind that practice that is consistent with what we know about how people learn, and you should have a goal in mind. Why am I doing this formative assessment? What am I trying to accomplish here? And it should be one of those 9 challenges of teaching. Okay? All right. So let's do a little demonstration here. We're going to do a test of critical thinking. I am going to read a sentence to you. All right, I want you to pay attention to that sentence because I'm going to ask you a question about that sentence, and that I want you to do your best to answer correctly. Okay, so here we go. First of all, on your handout, you need to turn to the last. It's not there. It's the second page where there is a box that says a test of critical thinking, right? Okay, so listen carefully to the sentence. Okay, the dressmaker used the scissors to cut the cloth for the dress. Okay, the dressmaker used the scissors to cut the cloth for the dress. Okay, all right. Now, here's what I want you to do. In the box, I want you to draw a picture of what the dressmaker used to cut the fabric. So don't give me a word, draw me a picture of what the dressmaker used to cut the fabric. I'll give you a few minutes to draw your answer. Some are obviously more artistic than others, and that's fine. Everyone had a chance to draw out their answer? Okay, so how was that? Was that easy or hard question? Pretty straightforward? Yeah.
I didn't know that. It's right.
Pretty sure you got it? All right, let's check your answer. Before we get to the correct answer though, let's look at some obviously wrong answers. Okay, so you shouldn't have drawn paper cutting scissors because they have rounded tips and they can't get underneath the fabric, right? And it has small finger holes which wouldn't allow you to put enough pressure to cut the fabric, right? Now, this has got nice large finger holes here, and it's padded, which is something you should have drawn because, of course, you know, a dressmaker would be wanting to like keep wear and tear and fatigue off fingers, right? And it's got pointed tips, which is really good, but these are straight, and what you really want in for a dressmaker is to have bent scissors that can get flat against the table and get under the fabric, right? And these are, you know, more like hair cutting shears. They have straight tips, but they're not bent, and there's no padding around the finger holes, right? Okay, so this is obviously the correct answer, right? So you have pointed scissor tips, you have large holes, you have padding to comfort the hand, and it's bent so that you can get flat to the table. How many got it right? All right. Well, what happened? Okay. I mean, I told you it was a test of critical thinking. It's written right there. You're supposed to think critically about this, right? So, how did critical thinking fail in this case? Right. So content was not enough, right? And just saying, you know, think critically, that's not enough, right? Because you didn't really understand what I meant by critical thinking, right? So have you ever had this happen before where you were expecting this very detailed, complex, sophisticated answer, students give you something really superficial and, you know, something that they knew before they even came into the class, right? So, you know, this kind of has happened to me a number of times. Okay, now, what can you do to ensure critical thinking? Well, a formative assessment would be a way of doing this. And what I want you to do is I want you to get together in some small groups, just turn to people. If you don't know each other, introduce yourself. And I want you to think, what kind of activity could we have done that could have helped to make it more likely that you actually understood kind of the level of answer that I wanted. So just take a few minutes, gather together, and come up with some ideas about how you might have used formative assessment to help you out on this.
Hello. Slide over back here.
What do you think?
Well, my first thought was I would like to be in that situation.
Yeah.
Try to cut it, even though I was also going to do that with all the abstract concepts in class.
Visualize that
Some sort of like activity.
I was thinking design, but because there's
Oh, yeah. First thing is try to
So.
but then they have to do some looking into it, or at least think about. If that's what you're right, prepare one.
Yeah, sure, right now it's walking to do about different contracts. What do you guys choose to talk about? The nature of scissors. I don't know, like it's the best. How does scissors to cut a paper? We're not doing, I mean, sewing, so, which I do, I kind of, and he said that. Still even yesterday. He said,
Just what I'm thinking is like you're doing a good job connecting it to your prior knowledge, but I have not that prior
Maybe
knowledge.
Right, and that's why when you get people into these documents, what's the next, if your goals.
That's true.
So that's one opportunity, right? And to construct that in different ways, like asking all kinds of questions,
Right, they
like
understand.
what would be hard about cutting cloth, right? And
Part of that.
what would be hard about cutting cloth and all that. And what are the qualities of cloth that make it?
Like, what's, you know, what are you trying to do to what's to come?
Because, you know, again, like I have an extra note that says there's another kind of stuff. It's called pinking and shearing, that's what you need the phrase easily.
People come up with some solutions.
It would be the situation.
Need more time, and you got some good answers. What did you come up with? What kind of ideas did you go? Anyone want to volunteer some approaches? stumped? There's no
Somehow
solution?
they need to figure out the background, because they have no background. If you have never cut cloth before, you wouldn't even know this.
Oh, okay.
So how would you provide them with the background information?
Okay.
So what are important considerations when cutting fabric for this industry?
Right.
Okay. All right. So you need to have an activity which demonstrates the dimensions of the problem, that not just any scissors are going to cut like heavy fabric or cloth. So how can you do that kind of thing?
We took our students and divided them into pairs and had them have conversations about scissors and the nature of the different scissors and their experiences with scissors. Because it turned out one of our students didn't like your critical thinking on the scissors and has experience with pinking shears.
Okay. So, well, it said scissors, not pinking.
Right, you said scissors, pinking shears or scissors.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's true.
Right.
Well, some people distinguish shear.
But again, so what we had was a class experience where we had two students talking, and then it moved from the dyad outward to here's the world of scissors,
Okay.
right? Our experience with scissors is, whatever.
Okay.
And then the instructor would know, in this class, there's some super scissors experienced students, and there's a whole subset of students who have limited scissors experience.
Yeah, but you don't want the limited scissor experienced students to group together, because then that would just make them confident and not knowledgeable about scissors.
Depending on how you manage after your dyads to share.
Yeah, that's always tricky, where you try to get the proper mix of different knowledge levels so they can teach each other, right?
That's not actually an assessment.
Sorry, what?
That's not an assessment, that's actually a classroom activity that you
Well,
that help you
but-
preload the assessment.
But it's an assessment for the students to learn more about, like, what they learn their knowledge of scissors is not as deep as they thought it was. So, they learn sort of what the different people have different knowledge than they think. So that would still be a form of assessment. It's not good for the teacher doesn't get a sense of what the students know, but the students at least realize that there's more to scissors than they might think, and that's still a useful tool to have. Now, another form of assessment may make it obvious to both the student and the teacher, and that may have advantages to that. So I think this is a good one. It's a little tricky to make sure that you have, this is the problem with group work. You always have that one group that kind of, goes south on you for whatever reason. And so if you had a group that is pretty sure that scissors are scissors, and then they're going to reinforce their own lack of knowledge, and that might be an issue. So that's something you have to think about, like, what are the pros and cons of different ways. So who came up with a different way? So we've got, like, background, and giving them background, like giving them maybe some cloth, and maybe giving them experience to cut with different kinds of scissors. Others, solutions? Yeah.
I believe Francesca and I brought up the idea, we were discussing almost like an imagery walkthrough of
Okay.
sorts. I'm not sure like how it would work, but thinking about it, just like visualizing like the situation of like setting up like your table with like your cloth and then like your scissors. Maybe like you could come across the problem of like you have the wrong scissors, but so it's just like you don't know that you have the wrong scissors, but you know it's not doing the job that you need it to do.
Okay.
And so maybe something like you could enable something of like, okay, like what is it that we need for you to then understand? It's just like there's different scissors.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so you could be like role playing in a way.
Yeah.
I mean, and so you could actually give them a set of scissors, different kinds of scissors, and say, if you're a dressmaker, which of these scissors would you choose? And so you have these different options there. That would be sort of obvious to both the teacher and the students as to kind of how they approach the scissors. So that's good. Anyone else come up with a different solution? Right. So it's really interesting. I think you all did a really good job. I mean, first of all, you've got to make it clear the context of the problem, and then you've got to make it clear that there's actually a variety of options, more options they might have thought about the variations of scissors. So here's a form of assessment that I might use is like, you give them pictures of like 5 different pairs of scissors, and you say, which of the following is most suited for dressmaking? All right, so you could also just bring in the actual scissors, but this is cheaper. You don't have to put 2 scissors. But a lot of these scissors you've probably never seen before. I think these are like carpet cutting shears, really heavy duty. Like, what is that for? And then hair cutting scissors. This is like trimming the nap or a carpet or something like this. Your cuticle scissors. So that gets them thinking. There are many kinds of scissors, and there are multiple uses. Right? And so this gets them at the level of understanding that I want them to be at, right? So it is saying, it's not just, I want, a pair of scissors is not the answer I want. It's like, what features does that pair of scissors have? So that's one way of getting it. That's sort of showing that level of understanding. And here's another one. These are embroidery scissors. What specialized features do they have for their function? Okay, what other kinds of specialized scissors do you think? This is very similar to the idea of getting students to think about the materials and what would be needed about that. Okay, so what I'm trying to do here is to get them to think about about scissors the way a dressmaker would, or someone who uses specialized pairs of scissors, and starting thinking about features. So I could give this beforehand, and it would alert them to those dimensions that I think are really critical, right? And that's what formative assessment is all about. Okay, so if students don't know what critical thinking looks like, they can't accomplish it even if they're capable of it, right? So that's one thing that formative assessment can do is you say, this is what formative assessment is in psychology, or in English literature, or in chemistry, right? They don't automatically know this, okay? Because critical thinking is kind of discipline specific. Okay, what is critical thinking, in your field? And formative assessment can help to model the kind of thought process that you want students to have. Okay, now let's talk about formative assessment and misconceptions. Okay, if you read the literature on misconceptions, it's very depressing. Students come into your class with misconceptions, and the odds of you correcting those misconceptions is very small. And if you do correct the misconception, the odds are that it is going to be temporary, that they will leave your class and revert back to the misconception they had because they've only had you for, 14 weeks, and then they go back into the real, they see things like in psychology, there's tons of misconceptions on TV and movies, and they get exposed to those. And the problem is that they're more confident in their misconceptions because they took your class, and they think that you have taught those misconceptions to them. Okay. So if you worry about what your students learn in your class, and this is a major problem, misconceptions is a serious problem. So what do we do about it? Okay. Typically the approach that people use is activation and refutation. So you activate the misconception, then you refute it. The results of this approach are mixed. At best, but it's probably the best general solution. Or you can use formative assessments, okay? And I think the evidence is pretty good that you can actually overcome misconceptions of formative assessments. And by overcome, I mean like you can convince maybe like 60% of the class that they're thinking incorrectly. Like I say, it's a depressing literature about misconception. All right, so I want to show you a formative assessment that is particularly good about addressing misconceptions. This is by Eric Mazur, who is a physicist at Harvard. He developed this whole pedagogical approach called peer instruction. The heart of peer instruction is something called a concept test. A concept test is basically a multiple choice question. It focuses on a single concept. It requires conceptual understanding itself, so it's a conceptual multiple choice question. It has response alternatives that are equally reasonable to a lay person. And if you have a misconception, the answer choices reflect the student's most common misconceptions. They have to be unambiguously worded, and they're either too easy or difficult. Okay. So that's how you create a concept test. It's basically a multiple choice question. But what's critical is the format. So you present the concept test, okay, you get the students to think about it, time to think about it. Then on a signal, they indicate their answer either by clickers or number of fingers or Kahoot, whatever you want to use, Socrative, whatever. And then the students pick someone around them, they discuss their choices 1 or 2 minutes. Then you repeat the poll, and then you explain and discuss the answer as a class. Okay, so all in all, doing the concept test takes about 5 to 10 minutes. And Missouri has really persuasive evidence that this really improves learning and it can overcome misconceptions. Okay, so I thought we'd give one a try, just so you can experience what this is like. Here's a concept test that I use in general psychology. So what I want you to do is I want you to read this and then think about and come up with your choice of answer quietly to yourself. Okay, so here's what you're going to do. On the count of 3, on the count of 3, you're going to just put your hand up with the number of fingers indicating your answer. Okay, so that way everyone has to participate. I actually like doing this better than clickers because in clickers, I think back to my own sort of lazy days of being a student, and with clickers, I think some students just like pick something and then they wait to see what the class does. The nice thing about just having hold your hand is you actually are personally responsible for your answer. Everyone is going to see, so I think you care more about that kind of thing. So, all right. So on the count of 3, you ready? 1, 2, 3. Put your hands. Okay. All right. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to just discuss with someone around you why your answer is correct, and if they disagree with you, why their answer is obviously incorrect. And then we'll come back and see if you were able to change each other's minds. So take a few minutes and discuss among yourselves.
I think we're all.
Or another one's like what we talking about what we were thinking when we were like are we talking about
I think for me, I actually have no idea what the just the emotional comfort, some sort of more mental process that maybe more it might have a reaction if they're not being
like
it's more of a basic drive just to be satisfied. Like, I don't know when they're crying, they're actually sad rather than just like gifts to other people.
Because I know that students are scared of words and
Big literature.
so something on the I felt like it had to do.
Yeah, well, is that what
do something. Right, and then doing the thing. They're ready, but they're not.
yeah.
But you actually
Okay. Give you another minute or 2. I appreciate how civilly everyone is discussing.
You
Oh, it was really easy.
We really didn't have.
One Zoom viewer.
Oh, that's why.
Yeah.
Okay, everyone had a chance to discuss it.
Strong personality student.
All right.
It's gonna be like.
Ready? We're gonna do the polling. Right. So we'll see the obvious consensus that has emerged from this. Okay, ready? 1, 2, 3, raise your hands. Anyone change their minds? So 2s and 3s and 4s. Okay. All right. So why 2? Anyone want to explain their reasoning? I thought 2. Now you're up.
Yeah. Well, I thought about it just from the perspective of my grandson. So I know that when he was first born, it's this whole, the bonding component of right after he's born, he's placed on the mother's chest and he has that like instantaneous sort of physical bond again with her. And I think that he goes back to work immediately, she spends the bulk of the time with him, and so he did very much so bond her. I also saw him bond to me as well, because I spent the first 2 weeks with him and I was up with him at night, because I don't sleep anyway, and then she would have him during the day. But then you could watch the shift take place when he had more of an ability to really figure out who the people in the room were. And then he started to bond towards the father, much more so between the age of 1 and 2. And so you could see that shift occur. So that's, without data to look at, you really can't, you're going by the assumption that you just have to make an assumption, I guess, because you don't really see, you're putting your faith in the fact that we believe this, right? There could be variables. I looked at 3 and I thought, you have children who are in orphanages that the only bonding they have with their caregivers is the fact that they're giving them, the sustenance that they need, but they're not giving them that physical bond that they get from a parent, because they just don't have time. So that's why I refuted that one.
Wow, you've gone through all 4 options there. That's great. So that was a great explanation and so you've really also done a very close reading of all the different alternatives there. So that's really good. So you think, like, how do you interpret this question? So you've really done a great job of thinking about like the different aspects of the question. Anyone want to add to that, or why they think certain alternatives are more correct? You picked a different one than 2, 3, or I don't know if I saw anyone ever do 1 at that point. But anyone want to add anything? You want to know what the correct answer is? So the answer is actually, it's 4. And it's a little misleading because a newborn in there. But actually, the key is it's a powerful emotional bond. So there's liking and there's like familiarity, but attachment is what this is about, and that's a powerful exclusive emotional bond that develops about 6 to 8 months, and it takes that long for exactly as you said, the infant to actually figure out this is the same person I saw before, right? And there's only one of them, right? There's some really clever studies done back in the 70s where you take a young infant, like 3 or 4 months, and you actually present them with 3 different images of their mother. And those young infants are really happy. Oh, look, 3 different moms. This is great, And so they'll actually share time with all 3 of them. But you take about a 6 to 8 month old infant who's attached, and you show them 3 different images of their mom, and they become very upset because they know at this point there's only one of them, right? And there's not, I can't have multiple moms. So, they have like developed cognitively, perceptually, so that they understand there's only one person. I can recognize this person from other people, and this is the person that I really am attached to. Okay, so a lot of students will think, it's immediately after birth. It's like a natural occurrence, and then I tell them that, well, the number 1 cause of death amendments is neglect and abuse. So it's not an automatic kind of thing. It actually takes 6 to 8 months, and it's this sort of shared mutual bond between infant and the responsive caregiver, and it develops independently to both parents. Okay, so this is an example of how you use a concept test to overcome those kinds of misconceptions. So the let me go back. All right. So the critical part of the concept test is the quality of the question itself, right? And then the procedure, okay? Poll, and then discussion and poll, okay? So Missouri came up with this, and originally he would hand out these cards from 1 to 4 that people would hold up. And clickers were actually invented to kind of simplify this process. The weird thing about this is that the clickers became more popular than peer instruction. So the clickers are the least important part of the whole process, but that's what people, kind of is like, I use clickers, so now automatically my students will learn better. But pedagogy is theory-driven practice to achieve a goal, right? So if you're, just because you're using clickers doesn't mean you're actually practicing formative assessment. It's this procedure that's really critical, and the quality of your question. Okay, all right. So that's one that you might think about and try. And certain areas actually have collections of concept tests out there. I know geology does, for example. So your whatever teaching organization is may actually have these kinds of concept tests used. Physics clearly does. A lot of sciences have really bought into this. In psychology, we don't for some reason. Okay. So here's some work I did. I'm just going to go over this briefly with misconceptions about correlations. So in statistics, we teach correlations. Correlations measure the relatedness between two dependent variables. They vary from -1 to 1. And the way you interpret a correlation is you break it down into 2 components. So the sign just tells you whether it's positive or negative. The absolute value tells you the strength of the correlation. The closer it is to an absolute value 1, the stronger it is. The closer to 0, the weaker it is. So a negative correlation is just as valid as a positive correlation. You just have to judge whether the strength based on the absolute value. And so it's a very common misconception that students have that a positive correlation is better than a negative one. And also correlations imply causation, something that psychology majors hear about 20 times a day in their classes. Okay, so this is a concept test I use to teach correlations, and I had 2 sections of general psych. So I gave the exact same explanation I give for correlations, but in one class I did the concept test. It was the only difference between the two sections. Okay. Then to test them, I did a factual question. Then I did a probe for understanding, and this is also a very interesting way of getting at student understanding. This is not a formative assessment because it actually occurs on the test itself. So I give a traditional multiple choice test, but then for extra credit or for like bonus points, at the end I pick one concept and I asked sort of a free response concept. So this is like, Samford decides ACT and SAT are obsolete. They decide to do a new college test. And they have 4 tests. Which one should Samford use? Okay, which should they adopt? So they should pick the strongest correlation here, which is -0.64, right? But it's a negative correlation. If they believe that positive correlations are stronger than negative correlations, then they'll pick 0.55. So this was, not only did they have to pick it, but they had to explain their reasoning. So this gives me insight into their reasoning, and it tells me how successful I've been as a teacher. So it's a very useful thing to do. And you get some really interesting answers for this. So here's just an incorrect answer. Test A, because 0.1 is the highest correlation. This person just doesn't understand magnitudes of 10. 1 is the perfect correlation, not 0.1. Okay, so here's people with a misconception, 0.55, because people who took test C made higher than the others, so their GPA would be higher. Right, so that's this person, this misconception is still there, and this is judging, gives me feedback about how effective I was at battling these misconceptions. This one is really interesting. Test C, since you'd want a positive correlation, not negative, even though test B correlation is greater, the correlation is negative, which would mean their GPAs were low. Okay, now this person almost gets it. Right, so they understand that correlation B is the strongest one, but they don't quite have that understanding. And this is kind of the nuance that you can get with this probe for understanding. Then you have a correct answer and explanation. Test B, even though it's negative, it's got the strongest correlation. Okay, this student has nailed the concept. And then you get some intriguing variations, like test B should be used because its confounding variables are more close to an absolute value of negative 0.64. The students already have enough stress as it is, only the highest scores, the ACT and SAT should be. So this student is guessing, right? The student has picked the right answer, but has guessed, right? Because they have no logical explanation at all. Now, this student I thought was really interesting. I think they would pick test C, even though 0.64 is bigger, it's also negative, resulting in negative correlation. They'd want the test scores and the grades to be positively correlated. So, like, I know what the correct answer is, but I am guessing that the administration would go for a positive correlation. This person is basically saying the administration is not smart enough to understand negative correlations, and so they pick a positive. So even though they picked the wrong one, they actually understood the concept, right? So this probe for understanding is kind of a good way of kind of getting at more nuanced kinds of responses. All right. But let me show you how the two classes did. Okay, so the blue bar is no concept test, and the red bar is with the concept test. B is the correct answer, C is the misconception. You see with no concept test, half the class fell for the misconception, right? Okay, now with the concept test though, the modal response was the correct response. So just adding that one concept test, okay, shifted the response to majority being correct. Now, 47% still got it wrong. Okay, I said misconception literature is very depressing to read, but it did shift it around. Okay, so those concept tests can be very powerful in helping you to assess or helping you to overcome misconceptions. All right, so there's a lot of advantage to concept tests, and I strongly encourage you to try them out. They're engaging, they can be used with any size class, they're great for stimulating class discussion, and the students learn from each other. It gives the students feedback, it gives the teacher feedback, and it gives students a preview of what kind of questions they can expect on an exam, which reduces whining. Oh, you know, that was such a tricky one. No, it was just like the concept. If you've been to class, you would have seen this sort of thing. So there's just a lot of advantages, and that just shows what formative assessment can do. Okay, all right. So this basically is getting at clicker questions. It should be use cognitive principles to achieve the desired learning goal. All right. Last topic, formative assessment and metacognition. So formative assessments can be used to improve metacognition. Student metacognition is typically pretty poor for a couple of reasons, and I'm going to go into more detail here than I did this morning. Okay, one of the problems with learning is that it doesn't feel like you're learning. Okay, so the best learning strategies actually don't feel like you're learning. Okay, and I'll go into why that is the case in a minute. I stole this slide from Bob Bjork, who's at UCLA, who's done a ton of work on learning strategies, especially related to education. And so this slide very nicely looks at some of the concepts that he has looked at, like interleaving, spacing, and what you have here is the red bars are the actual performance. So blocked practice, where you study like one topic for 3 hours and another topic for 3 hours, versus interleave, where you alternate. 1 hour, one topic, another hour, a second topic, third hour you go back to the first topic. It's more difficult, but Bjork calls them desirable difficulties, but it leads to better learning. So this is the actual learning. You can see that the actual learning, is improved, like spaced versus massed, random practice versus block practice. It's very compelling. But look at the blue bars. The blue bars is what the students judged would be best for their learning. See how in almost every case, the student judgment is a mismatch with the actual learning performance. Okay. Now, what happens here is that students are confronted with the evidence they actually did better under interleaved, and they believe it's because they were lucky. Oh, I just guessed right that time. They actually they hold on to their intuitions because they're misconceptions and they're hard to change. So they actually have very poor metacognitive awareness. I actually had this with my own son. He was in, this is when he was middle school, he was in Science Olympiad, which is one of those activities, and for some reason he got assigned to do water quality. And so what they had to do was, they were given a PowerPoint presentation of water quality, and they were taking a test over it. Whoever had the highest score of the test won. So he looked at this. Of course, he was going through it. And I said, "Don't just go through it. You should create a concept map of the different concepts." And for some odd reason, he actually followed my advice this time, and he actually created this concept map. All right. And then he went and he did this, and he thought it went okay. And lo and behold, he was the high scorer, and he got the gold medal for water quality. And I said, "Isn't that great? That concept map really helped." He goes, "Well, I was just lucky. I just guessed right on this." He wasn't willing to attribute the better performance because it doesn't feel like you're learning. It's difficult. It's not necessarily pleasant. It doesn't feel like you're learning. Okay. Now, why is that the case? I'm looking there. Okay. And this is also a problem with bad study strategies. Bad study strategies increase confidence without increasing actual learning. So students use bad study strategies to promote bad metacognitive awareness. Okay. So what they're promoting is familiarity, and this is the issue here. Students mistake familiarity with learning. Okay. So the more familiar you are with something, the more you think you will know it, the more you think you'll remember it. Okay. When in fact that's not learning. Familiarity is not the same as learning. Now, there was a really intriguing study that came out a few years ago. What is this?
Apple.
Okay, Apple logo. And so it's very familiar. Students see this all the time. Okay, but Blake, Nazarian, and Castell asked students to pick out the correct Apple logo from 12 different options. And they found that only 12 options, 53% failed. Less than half of them could actually correctly pick it out. Something as familiar as that, something they see every day, they were highly confident that they would know it, but more than half failed. And when asked to draw it, only 1 out of 85 people could actually draw a logo. Some of them are kind of like in outer space, like should be pomegranate and things like that. So this is a really strange one also. So students mistake familiarity with learning, and that's the reason why rereading is so popular, because it's easy to do and it really builds familiarity. But the problem is that it builds false confidence and poor metacognitive awareness. So students confusing familiarity with learning. This, by the way, is not the Apple logo. This is the Apple logo. Okay, so it's got a little notch underneath. Okay, so formative assessment can be used to help students assess their own level of understanding. Okay, and it is also useful for teachers as well. This is a great quote from Piaget. Every beginning instructor discovered sooner or later that his first lectures were incomprehensible because he was talking to himself. Mindful only of his point of view, realized only gradually with difficulty it's not easy to place oneself in the shoes of students, not yet know about the subject matter of the course. So teachers often have poor metacognitive awareness of what students are going through. And then I talked earlier about the curse of expertise. The more that we teach a subject matter, the harder it is for us to remember what it's like not to remember, or not to know something. So formative assessment not only gives you feedback, but it gives the students feedback. Now, I'm going to finish up here, and I'm just going to say it's not enough to give the students that feedback, because students oftentimes don't recognize the value of that feedback. They don't know how to use it. I don't know if this is true at Springfield, but at Samford, when I give exams back, the students who don't do well, they're never the ones who actually come to see me, right? And if I hand back the exams, a lot of times they'll throw the exams away, especially if they did badly, because they don't want to be reminded of that. They don't see it as an opportunity to improve themselves, to diagnose what they need to change to do better. So, providing that feedback is important, but you have to guide students as to how to use that feedback and how to take that feedback and improve their performance next time. I have an activity called an exam wrapper. They come out of Carnegie Mellon. It's a terrible name. I hate the name. It's really an exam debriefing activity. So I use it after my first exam. It walks them through their preparation. When did you actually read the material, or did you read only the chapter, the summaries? And then how much time do you spend in review? And then they have to look at their exam. They have to identify the ones they missed and why they might have missed them. Was it material that was in the notes? Was it material in the textbook? Then they have to watch my video series on how to study. Then they've got to come up with a concrete plan. 3 things you can do differently next time based on the information in the videos. And then they have to create a plan. Like, this is when I'm going to start studying. This is when I'm going to finish reading everything. This is how many days I'm going to spend in review. This is how I'm going to study with full focus and without distractions. All right, and then that kind of leads them to the next exam. So it is a structured way of gaining feedback and utilizing feedback to improve their performance. And we've had a really good success with this. We've done a number of studies. Sometimes we get significant, we almost always get an improvement. Sometimes it's significant, sometimes it's not. But what it's really good at is providing a framework for us to work with the students, because this is a systematic review of their preparation, and it really forces them to think about why they missed certain things. If you have students who've done poorly, they come in and the first thing you ask them is like, well, how well prepared were you for that exam? And they'll always say, oh, I thought I was pretty well prepared. But this really walks them through each step, and that's really valuable. So if you're interested in that exam wrapper, email me. I'd be happy to send that to you. Okay. All right. Concept maps is another powerful one that you might use. This is actually one of my students in research methods a few years back. So she arrived at the classroom early and just wrote everything she knew on the board there. And then she's a lovely person, but I love this look. It's like, she's daring me to ask her something she doesn't know about research methods. And it can be used in any point. There's a number of different formative assessments. Think, Pair, Share is a common one. Just tons and tons of different, they're very flexible. And there's some resources on formative assessment. I'm sure Chris can help you with these, but Angelo and Cross is the classic. It's been updated by Claire Major and Elizabeth Barkley. And then these two are also good, embedded formative assessment, making things visible. Take a look at these, and there's tons of stuff on the web also about these. Actually, I don't think that's on the, I don't have those listed. I should have, but I didn't do that. So hopefully I've convinced you that formative assessment is an incredibly valuable tool to you. I've given you some ideas about how to use it, and I've given you some of the principles for designing these things in a way that will really be goal-directed and really improve different aspects of student understanding and student learning. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Open to any questions anybody's got?
Will PowerPoint be available?
Sure. I'm happy to, I can send them to Chris.
Thanks.
I think we just want to thank you for being here today, Dr. Chu, and sharing everything with us. It's really, really great to have you here.
Oh, thanks. Appreciate it. Appreciate visiting the campus. It's a lovely campus. I can't wait to tour around a little later. Who's going to show me the highlights. So thank you again.
Thank you very much.